to have in the lineup three of my favorite development economists in the world and friends. We have Seema Jayachandran from Northwestern, Rohini Pandey from Yale, and Leonard Washington from Princeton University. And we'll do 15-minute talks. During the talk, you can ask clarifying questions, which I'm going to collect and then pass them on to the speakers. And then we'll open up the mic for questions for 5 minutes after each talk. So you came to hear Seema, Rohini, and Leonard. So why don't you take it on, Seema?
Terrific. Thanks so much for including me in this session and in the conference. The whole conference looks terrific. So I'm going to present on something that's unusual for me and unusual for economics, which it's not testing a hypothesis. It's trying to improve measurement. And specifically, I work a lot on gender, and one of the concepts that I often want to measure of is women's agency. And so this is a project that was like born of trying to figure out what's the best way to measure women's agency, and can we do it in a systematic way. And so this is like ends up being a methodological contribution about combining machine learning and qualitative interviews. And it's with Monica Beard-Davolu, who's a qualitative sociologist, and Jan Cooper, who's a health services researcher. And it's very much an interdisciplinary project where Monica's expertise in particular was really crucial to this. Okay, so there are what psychologists would call latent constructs, which are not something that we have a concrete observable measure of, but that we have an idea of some concept, and we often want a short survey measure, of it. One example is women's agency, which is, I'm not going to talk a lot about that concept, but it's about the ability to affect your life by having power to make choices and to control resources. And so then the question is, if you say it's a secondary interest in your study and you want to have a handful of questions to use, what should you use? And at least the way I've done it is often in an ad hoc way, or I think the default questions people often use is the demographic and health survey questions. And I think so what we would like is some way of deciding or choosing questions in a more systematic way. And so what this project is a procedure for systematically choosing questions. And so that's the contribution is mainly this method. And in brief, what we're going to do is sort of pick a gold standard, pick something that we think is a really rich, correct measure of that construct. And we're going to use coded qualitative interviews, so open-ended interviews coded by qualitative researchers as a measure, as the true measure of women's agency. And then we're going to then the method is identifying close-ended survey questions. So we're going to be looking for 5 survey questions that, when combined, best predict that truth. And so we're going to do that using what in the machine learning literature is called feature selection algorithms that are trying to find sort of the 5 best, 5 is arbitrary, but 5 best questions. And so what I've discovered in the measurement literature is you need a name for everything. And so we named this method MASI, which is maternal aunt in Hindi, for machine learning and semi-structured interviews. In addition to that, our context is North India. And so another contribution is for North India, or at least you can decide on the external validity within North India or beyond North India, but it's a new short survey module, an index to measure women's agency. So just the terminology I'm using, the module is the set of questions, and then ultimately we often want to have one measure as an outcome or on the right-hand side of a regression. And so the index is a scalar that's aggregating those questions. Okay, so we did this data collection in one district in Haryana, in Kurukshetra, in 2019, and we worked in randomly selected villages, 21 rural villages, and we chose married women with children. So that was sort of we decided to kind of make our index applicable to that group. You might have a different one for adolescent girls. And so we surveyed 209 married women. They had to have a child under age 10, and the women are about 30 years old on average, pretty highly educated part of India. And so then what do? We measured women's agency in different ways. So we're going to have a quantitative survey, which has close-ended questions, the kind of questions that as development economists, we would often put on our surveys. And we have basically try to concatenate all of the top hits of questions you might consider. So we had 63 questions that were trying to be the common ones that you might use. So we drew them from the Relative Autonomy Index, which is developed by psychologists, and that's the basis of WEA, which is a well-known measure of women's agency. We use the demographic and health survey questions, some miscellaneous questions that had been assembled in a toolkit that JPAL put together, and then the sexual relationship power scale, which is another often used scale of power dynamics within couples. So those are our contender survey questions. And then we had these semi-structured interviews, which are going to serve as our gold standard. And they were conducted by 2 qualitative interviewers. They were about 45 minutes long, and we divided it up into 6 domains of fertility, mobility, household expenditures, employment, children's health, and children's education. So here too, we made some judgment that we were interested in women's agency over these domains kind of collectively. And so the open-ended interviews, the semi-structured part of interviews is there's a guide, but the interviewers use their judgment to probe answers or reword questions as they see fit. And so then we have those qualitative interviews. That's just free text. That's not quantitative. And so we code the surveys, we code those interviews using the methods of qualitative researchers. So it's sort of, you use a qualitative coding software, you define a coding tree, which is how you're going to map different kinds of answers to whether that's high agency or low agency in that domain. And so what we did was, or I didn't participate in this part, but what our team did was code each of those qualitative interviews, each of the women, into a score of 1 to 4 across these 6 domains, and then we averaged them. And we tried kind of whether different ways of aggregating, there's some, again, judgment calls and how you translate these codes into one quantitative score. So here you can see our data. We have this distribution of women's agency where 4 is higher than 1, which is lower in these 6 domains. And they're not completely correlated with each other, because when we average them all together, we get a pretty decent normal distribution. And so this is our overall measure of women's agency from these qualitative interviews, where the idea is we're going to treat this as a really rich, correct measure of agency because it's based on this kind of free-form conversation and with expert coding. And so then the next step is to say, okay, with that measure of the truth, let's pick some close-ended questions that work well. And this is the machine learning analysis. So it's very much a prediction exercise. We're not trying to do anything causal here. We're saying which of these survey questions predict this truth. And so we choose 5 as our length. You could choose 6 or 10 or 2. And as I said, this is called feature selection in the machine learning, where it's normal machine learning, but you are constraining how many features or variables are selected. So there are a bunch of different methods in the literature for how you do this variable selection. So we didn't want to kind of innovate here. We're taking off the shelf existing methods, and we use multiple methods, partly because there's no consensus, but also just to understand how sensitive are, which are the best questions to the specific algorithm you use. So we use 3. One is called lasso stability selection, and that builds on lasso. And I'm going to only present that one just in the interest of time. And I think it's probably the one that best balances various objectives. Like, it's simple, you can understand it. The second one is based on random forest, and that's more flexible, and it's going to be richer and often has better predictive power, but the cost is it's more black box. And so I kind of think, depending on people's preference for transparency versus better predictability, you might choose between 1 or 2. And then the third method is not really machine learning at all. It doesn't have the same properties of addressing overfitting, but it's very simple. It's just like iterating OLS regressions, and it's backward sequential selection. So just to explain the first method of lasso stability selection, it's basically taking random subsamples of the data and running standard lasso, and then keeping track of which of the variables were selected in that lasso iteration. So we have 63 contender variables. Some of them are selected when we run lasso, and if we have subsamples, it's going to be a different set each time. And then when you rank, this one was picked 90% of the time, 76% of the time, et cetera. And we do that with 1,000 iterations. And then the best variables are the ones that are chosen most often over those different iterations of lasso. And And then we need to combine them into an index. So, in those regressions, we mapped each question to one linear variable. We've tried variations on this, and they're all coded so a higher value represents more agency. And then, one option to combine them is to use the predicted value of the regression. We take a different approach just that we think is a little simpler, which is we normalize each of those variables and take the average of them. So kind of this stance we're taking is this is really good at selecting variables, but the actual weights you would put on them, the regression in one context might not be applicable elsewhere. Okay, so the results, what do we get out of this? So here I'm going to show you the results, the questions that are picked with lasso stability selection, and then kind of show you how they compare across these three methods. So what this is showing you is the top 10 questions, and if you wanted a 5-question index, you'd pick these first 5, and I'm showing in the right is how often they're chosen. And so the questions that are selected are very much in the domains of household expenditures and mobility and then children's health. So across these 6 domains, we have only 3 domains represented. So one is about whether your opinion is heard when an expensive item like a bicycle or cow is purchased. Do you need permission to buy clothing for yourself? Are you permitted to visit women in other neighborhoods to talk with them? So interestingly, like the first question is quite similar, a little bit more specific, but quite similar to a DHS question. And then, there's some other questions I wouldn't have necessarily picked, guessed which questions were picked. I think one thing that I found striking is that we have some sort of more general questions, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much power do you think you have? None of those questions were selected. It was always kind of much more kind of concrete questions that got selected. This is showing you the comparison across which questions are picked across those 3 different algorithms. So I showed you kind of the column 1, and columns 2 and 3 are these 2 different methods where it's ranking the order in which they're chosen. And a couple things to kind of point out is, there's a decent amount of overlap, that there's always 3 questions overlapping between 2 methods, even though we're choosing from 63. So, there's a possibility if we had chosen 15 different questions across these, we end up choosing 8. And down here is the predictive power of the indices. And you could see it once we kind of take this standardized index, they all perform pretty similarly. And even this one, what's I think interesting is the ML ones that address overfitting, they do as well as this backward selection, which is probably overfitted. And then, I guess this 0.784 is saying, if you're willing to take the black box nature of random forest and use its predicted value, that's where you can kind of do quite a bit better. My takeaway from this is it's not that these are like the 5 best, but I see this method as useful for saying here are the 10 best questions or the 8 best questions. And in particular are our top 1 and 2 kind of really stand out. So I see this as helping you winnow what questions to use, saying these ones are definite ones to use. These ones are definite, you definitely shouldn't use. And then in between, the last 3 you use, there's probably, 3 out of 10 you could have chosen and it wouldn't have made a big difference. So we can think about, how well do these do, and there are different benchmarks that we try to think about, is this a good measure? So one is just to say, how much predictive power do these indices have compared to if we had just arbitrarily picked 5 questions and combined them. And so this histogram is if we had arbitrarily or randomly chosen questions, and you can see each of these 3 indices do better in terms of how well they predict this qualitative index, or kind of how well they predict other things we think are correlated with women's agency, like the age gap between a husband and a wife. And maybe more strikingly, if we use all of the 63 questions and combine them into an index with principal component analysis, which is a common way of combining questions, the indices using 5 questions do quite a bit better. And so that might not seem important once we've collected the data, but the whole goal here is you don't need to collect the 63 questions. If you have 20 questions or 50 questions and combine them into an index, you could do as well or better if you just have 5 well-chosen questions. Okay, so just to wrap up, the goal here was to pragmatically for myself and other people who work in North India to try to create a survey module and index for measuring women's agency that kind of maybe we feel more comfortable using because there's something systematic. So I think, this project is very much born of my sort of lack of satisfaction with how lots of researchers choose, or even in other disciplines, how, you might kind of think about test, retest correlations, but this method is grounded in, like, let's look at something external that we think is a true measure and then pick based on that. So, I think this new method is interesting, and there's more that one could do. You could sort of replicate this elsewhere, and there's no reason to think the best questions are the same in Uganda as India, but it'd be interesting to see to what extent there is overlap. You could take a goal of doing data collection in multiple places and saying, I'm not looking for the best module for India or Uganda, but a module that's like a mini-max criterion that does pretty well in multiple contexts. That would be very practical, because you often want a common measure across places. And then I think there are kind of other constructs besides women's agency, not just even in development economics. People in political science think about political polarization, or concepts like that, or cultural assimilation. There are lots of concepts that are kind of fuzzy, where we think open-ended questions might get at them better, but we ultimately need, as quantitative researchers, a short module. And so I think this method is a structured way of trying to get those short modules. I'll just add that we also had a second gold standard using a lab game. So a different approach, instead of qualitative interviews, would have been a revealed preference measure, like a lab game. I still think that's an interesting approach. In our case, the lab game we used didn't end up working well to measure women's agency. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Seema. So Juan has a question.
Yes. Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you so much, Seema. That was super interesting. I really like this new. I really like the use of these methods, sort of to get shortcuts to do interesting stuff, especially given the fact that doing field work and doing these expensive interviews is expensive. And one interesting part of my job is to advise grad students in the global south. So for them to learn these shortcuts I think is great. I was just curious to see if you, and I apologize if I missed this and you actually mentioned it, if you did some sort of kind of out of sample prediction, in the sense that probably with part of the sample, you first predicted what the empowerment was, or the agency was, sorry, and then exposed without the interviewees knowing what the predicted score was, do the qualitative interview and come out with the qualitative score to see if there was a good prediction exposed with a part of the sample.
Yeah, so these machine learning methods, like, there are kind of two ways. And within these, each of, say, an iteration of lasso or random forest, there is a leave out sample that's being used to kind of tune the parameters in each model. But above and beyond that, from the whole get-go, that whole exercise could leave out part of the sample and then just validate outside of that. Ideally, we would have done that, but we had a relatively small sample for machine learning, yet, a huge sample for qualitative interviews, which is 209 people. So we didn't end up doing that. Kind of after the fact, we did do something where we tried to say, almost for a practical reason, because qualitative researchers said, there's no way we can do 200 all the time. Would this have worked with 100? So we did an exercise where that's somewhat similar, that sees, like, how well do you kind of reproduce things if you had used 100, and then we can validate it on the other 100. And I think the answer there is what I was saying on one slide, which is, I think you don't get the exact same 5, if you replicate out of sample, or you had used a smaller sample to begin with, but you do a pretty good job of finding the best 1 or 2 questions, and then winnowing down to the 8 to 10 best ones. And then and so that's kind of where I think we sort of plateau on the likelihood function, or the optimization at that level.
Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? So I have a question, Sima. I'm a complete foreigner to this literature, but here it seems like you're taking all this bundle of 63 questions, which are measuring different dimensions of woman agency, and just throwing it at the machine to tell us what's the best way of capturing this sort of very broad concept. Is there a reason we would care about like different dimensions of women agency, or would you want to restrict or sort of cluster the subcomponents of your questions, and how would that play into?
Yeah, so I think yeah, no, it's a great question. We have these domains, and then why aren't we having a measure for each domain, or and I think you could imagine saying I want to know women's agency around fertility, and I want 3 questions for that. And so we could have done that. We could have said let's just pick our fertility questions and then our subscore for fertility and predict it. So like just for simplicity in what I'm presenting, we didn't do that. But interestingly, I guess often I think people just have a one measure of women's agency, whether that's right or not. And, there is some positive correlation across the domains. And interestingly, like if you didn't restrict and you said, what's the best predictors of fertility, sometimes questions in other domains are picked out instead. So I think like the questions about mobility and decision-making over expenses often get picked out as predictors in other domains. And that could simply be because, women understood those questions better. And so there was more signal to noise in the answers. It doesn't have to be something about like, deep, it could just be about measurement. But I guess the interesting thing is that, if you are interested in overall measure, like, or even measurement of fertility, of agency over fertility, the best measures of it might not be the fertility questions. That's sort of speaking to kind of a broader question that sometimes like the quality of the question and whether people understand it is influencing how well it's measuring what we want it to measure.
It's very interesting. Okay, we started a couple of minutes late, so if there are no more questions, we may want to move on to Rohini's presentation. Thank you very much, Seema.
Thanks.
Great. Can you see my presentation? Okay. Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation. I also think this session probably is going to encapsulate the huge variation in the topics covered in development. So if people came here for a particular domain, I guess they're not going to find that. So this is work that I've been doing with some of my long-term collaborators. Patrick and Ariel are graduate students. Erica is at Duke, and Natalia is at Harvard Business School. And I think what really got us started here was seeing that there's been a lot of recent literature thinking about, persistent gains from asset transfer programs. And I think there's kind of a robust and exciting set of evidence suggesting that many of these transfer programs seem to have gains that persist over time. And given the length of time that field experiments have been going on for, you can now track these. And there's quite a lot of evidence of, same generation poverty traps being broken, if you will, by these transfers. The income gains are persistent and often increase over time. But what I think this tells us less about is what this means for intergenerational transmission. So you can imagine a case where, the Gallo and Zaira is the classic model, that you relax credit constraints, poor households recognize that they also want to invest in their children's education, and this reduces intergenerational poverty traps. But there's another view that you become richer, but you still face this trade-off. You face a trade-off between whether you invest in your own enterprise or you invest in your children. And that will depend both very much on how much above the poverty trap you are and how you think of these relative returns. So what we wanted to do in this paper is really ask about, is there evidence of this trade-off? And overall, when we look at these reductions in same generation poverty, should we be excited and think about it as also reflecting gains for future generations? So what we're going to build on is an 11-year follow-up that we have of a microfinance experiment that we did in urban India. I think urban areas are useful for this because they actually have a reasonable supply of schooling and college opportunities. And we're going to look at both effects on educational mobility and some effects on socioeconomic, although for lack of time, I suspect I'm not going to talk about that very much. So I said our setting is urban India. It's a setting where there's been a lot of evidence showing that actually intergenerational educational mobility remains low, especially despite recently quite a lot of gains in income. And these low educational mobility is partly linked to also low occupational mobility, because the main gains in income that you get in the longer run is from transitioning out of self-employment to salaried employment. College admissions in this environment depend on high-stakes secondary exams, where to get through which parents invest quite a lot in private schooling and after-school tutoring. Seema, for instance, has, I think, written earlier about the rise of after-school tutoring, which is a common phenomenon, I think, in a lot of the developing world. College in India has relatively high upfront costs. So when we look in our control group, this is roughly what a 3-year college education costs. But it's also worth remembering that these graduates have significantly higher earnings. And so over a lifetime, you more than break even. So in terms of what's been happening to education in India, my results are going to come from a small sample, but let me just give you some sense from the National Family Health Survey of what the change has been. So what you see here is each of these 3 panels show you the gains in primary schooling, secondary, and college over time. The grayed out area reflects the time that was relevant for, if you will, the adults in our cohort, so the adults who got the loans. And then the darker shade is the children that we're going to look at. I think 2 things I would take away from this is the primary schooling is essentially ubiquitous by now. And the second fact, which I think I hadn't realized the importance of until I looked at this data, is the gender gap is basically on education is close to 0. And I think the way this has been often seen together with the fact that gains from labor markets are low for women is that there are potentially returns to education on the marriage market, which is also something we'll look at. So against this background, what's the sample that we're looking at? So our sample is from a single city. It's roughly 850 microfinance clients. And the intervention did was in 2007. We had a treatment where everyone got the credit contract. The control group got the classic Grameen contract, which has often been noted doesn't have great household returns. But our treatment was we gave a flexible contract with a 2-month grace period before repayment began. The short-run results, which were not that short, I guess they were 3 years later, and we've sort of shown these earlier, we see a 20% increase in household income, and the returns are very comparable to other cash drop or credit programs of 6 to 13%. What's important for us at the time of our baseline, over half our households had a school-going child. So we actually have a sample which is young enough that we can look at their children. And what we're going to do here is look at data from 2 additional surveys, one after 5 years and one after 11 years. So just to summarize, we started in 2007, till 2010, we reported the results in an earlier paper. Should just note, even though I'm not going to have time to talk about it, is just after our survey ended, there was the India microfinance crisis, which was a big liquidity shock to these households. We have 2 additional surveys, one at 5 years at 2012, and the one in 2018, where one thing we did was we got a full child roster of all children, not just those living at home, with their educational outcomes. So when we look at these income gains over time, we find, obviously we replicate our 3-year results, we find that the gains narrow over time, but are persistent. I should also note that since we did this work, there have been several papers looking at different aspects of flexible credit contracts. And our 3-year estimates are very consistent with what they find. We also, so if you take this and you try to see what this means in terms of numbers, on average, our control household, which has 4 members, earn roughly $10,000 a year. And over 11 years, you can think about the average treatment household essentially gaining 1 additional year of income. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. So that against that background, these are households that have seen a reasonable increase in their income. We want to ask what happened to the next generation. So if you look at the households in our sample, we basically have, this is the children's sample. So we think of it as three groups. So we have those who are less than 7 years, so they're too young at end line to have transitioned to college. We have, if you will, a placebo group for education who are over 17. And then we have the main sample, which is between 7 to 17. So in our paper results, we obviously look at overall effects and then for these three subgroups. Today, for kind of shortage of time, I'm going to focus mainly on the main sample. And just to show you kind of one result for the full sample so that you can see where the data is, this is something, one of my main results, which is college attendance. So this is from a local polynomial regression. The sample is too small to really fit standard errors significantly over this entire sample. But what you can see that the gains in college attendance are really concentrated in the middle. And again, I mean, you can move these things to 5 to 18. It doesn't really make much difference. But I'm going to show you in a regression framework some of our main results and largely focus on the main child sample. So what do we see? So the first thing we see, so when we look at these kids in the main child sample, we see an increase in children and parental investment, not much in primary, which I think is not surprising given that they're mainly there, a lot in secondary school investment. And when we break down the sub-index, it's both driven by private school expenditures and a very large increase in after-school tutoring. And then we also find some weak increases in college spending. When we look overall, we don't really see a lot of increases in completed secondary schooling. I mean, the noisy increases, but we do see a significant increase in college attendance. And so just to give you a sense of this, the base in the control group of college enrollment, which is very similar to the national figures I showed you earlier, is 28%. And we see sort of on that base, a 34 percentage point increase, 34% increase. So what we're interested in next is, again, to go back to thinking about this trade-off. So on average, we see rises. On average, we do see evidence that it appears that increasing same generation income raises educational outcomes to the next generation. But we're also interested in asking is, do we have any evidence that this is happening in the face of households facing trade-offs? So I'm not going to have time to go through this, but we write down a model where we have lump sum education and business investment, where once you receive a liquidity shock in the short run, in 2007, everyone invests in the enterprise. But then after that, you can choose whether to reinvest in continuing to grow your enterprise or in your child's education. There are two aspects that are going to matter, which is the amount of initial wealth you start with and your perceived or actual returns to education. And I'll talk, I'm not going to have as much time to talk about this, about the difference between those two, because we actually have predictions on the partial tuition. Today, I'm just going to show you how the effects differ by education level of parents, which is something that we had pre-specified in our pre-analysis plan. So here what you see is we define a household as being high educated if at least there is some secondary schooling among either the mother or the father. And you basically see that's where the gains are concentrated. So the gains that we see are coming off households where parents have more than primary education. And if anything, we actually see some evidence of dropout in low education households. And so just to give you a sense of the other results that we think suggest that this trade-off is at work, what we see is that by 2018, the actually differences in income are no longer present for high education, treatment, and control households. We interpret this as treatment households are investing in education rather than business. But among the low education households, treatment households have a significantly 34% higher income than their control counterparts, which again, I think is, we find that also shows up in differences in capital. Among low education households, we find treatment children are more likely to drop out of school. We had a module where we asked about school dropout. We had a module where we asked about child labor across the years, and we can show that they are more likely to work in the household enterprise. And importantly, we also see that for girls, the gains are, as I said, there is nothing in terms of gender differences in education, but certainly that education for girls means that they're less likely to be housewives. And this is both coming a bit from the fact that they are less likely to be married and more likely to be in college. We also find some weak evidence that there is improved assortative matching for them. They're more likely to marry, conditional on being married, they're more likely to marry a spouse who is college education, but we probably need to wait a few more years to have that robustly. So just to summarize, these average educational gains come at the same time as some increases in next generational educational inequality. So we find positive treatment effects for the children of high educational parents, but none or not negative effects for low education parents. So against this background, I want to kind of go back to asking, I talked by starting about we have evidence on the same generation poverty trap. Do we have evidence that this also seems to translate cross generation? So just very quickly, in our data, if we kind of graph attending college against socioeconomic index for the control group, which is in blue, you definitely see this non-linear relationship. I don't know if I'll go as far as to say it's S, but it's certainly non-linear. And what you can see is that in the treatment group, there's just an increase up in the likelihood to attend college, which is very much driven by the middle of the wealth distribution. This is going back to the IHDS data to ask, a little bit more in terms of external validity. Are our results from a small sample consistent with perhaps what we would expect in observational data in IHDS? I mean, IHDS is a panel. So what we can look at is household income in 2005 and whether their children attended college in 2012. You can see our households on average do fall in the part where we should expect an increasing relationship. And if we look at just the difference in this for our control samples income in 2010, we would expect roughly a 5 percentage point increase in college attendance. So let me conclude with one last thing, which is, I think, there's been a lot of interest in the US literature of trying to use these early childhood interventions to then predict lifetime earnings. And you can imagine in the long run, as we start thinking about these experimental results, sometimes when we say we see effects disappear, that could be because we're actually not accounting for the earnings that are coming, for instance, from children who have gotten more education. So what we do is we follow the kind of Hendren-Sprunger approach and forecast child earnings by using age earning curves from IHDS. And what we find is that on average, we find an internal rate of return, which I think is very comparable to or higher than other estimates. And then the last thing I would end with is to say that we also then split it up by asking, how does this increasing educational inequality affect it? And what we see is that, of course, what matters a lot is if you just focus on educational returns, then actually the low educational households look worse than the control. Remember, there's increased dropout. But if you also account for the economic returns, for the fact that these children start working and actually seem to have some ability to earn at a reasonable income rate, then we find that the effects are positive throughout. So just to summarize, we look at a relatively small liquidity shock, but one that compounds over time. And we find that these increases in same generation household income do translate into increased intergenerational educational mobility, I think measured by a very important outcome for households, which is college education. But we also find evidence that within this group, there do exist these trade-offs, and the educational and socioeconomic gains are more likely to be associated for children with higher educational households. And so we have high education inequality, but on average, what I think it's informative of is that, increased educational inequality in this case actually goes with increasing economic gains for all households. And I make that point because very often in low income countries, we now just look at educational mobility as a measure of economic mobility by saying that we can't get income data, so let's just look at educational mobility. I think our results kind of point out in a setting where there are still returns from low-skilled employment, this may not always be correct to do. So let me stop here. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to just open up your microphone and ask your questions. Yes, it's too early in the morning. People are, maybe we can let people think about their questions and go back to them after Leonard's presentation. You want to go ahead, Leonard? Okay, perfect.
Gianmarco, there's a question. I don't know if you want to take it now.
Yes, Carlos, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Yes, I was wondering whether, since there is an impact in secondary school attendance, I wonder whether you could observe any delay in adolescent fertility or in pregnancy in general.
So as I said, we see delays in marriage, and in India, there isn't a lot of out of marriage fertility. So I think you would expect to see a decline in children as well. But 11 years is long, but it's not long enough to have everyone move through the point where they would have the first child. So we stopped at this paper looking at marriage outcomes. But I would expect that to suddenly delay age of first child and therefore overall fertility.
Thanks. Any other questions? No. All right. So why don't you take it on, Leonard?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, the organizers, Juan in particular, for the invitation. So it's a paper on state capture, the form of state capture, and I joined with Nathan from Houston and Raphael from Princeton and myself. So let me start with the motivation. State capture, which is firm influencing state policy for their benefit, is prevalent and affecting policy, stability, and even trust in governments. And it tends to have many forms. For instance, one form which is very direct, like in the Gupta brothers in South Africa, is when firms directly control the state apparatus by sometimes appointing ministers. And you also have a form that in Nigeria, for instance, where the richest man have favorable policies through campaign contribution, and then the politician that basically get the government to implement the favorable policy for the firm. So it's a very general phenomenon, Europe, Latin America, US, and there is a vast literature to cover those different forms. And whether it's regulatory capture, bureaucratic capture, patronage, or lobbying, and so on. So now it's what we're trying to do in this paper is to try to see political conditions that will lead to one form of capture or the other, as opposed to looking at when state is captured or not. So let me start by operationalizing what we mean by direct or indirect capture. The direct form is when firms buy off government officials directly. Sometimes it's through relationships or through regulatory capture, and because the bureaucrats are around for a longer time, and politicians are moving in and out. So sometimes you benefit from actually capturing the bureaucrats directly. So indirect form is when the policy to be implemented by bureaucrats is directed first by the politician. So you lobby the politician instruct the bureaucrats to implement the favorable policy to the firm. And sometimes, in some real world situations, what you observe is it's a portfolio of different forms. So what we do is to study the choice of different forms of state capture by firms and how it relates to electoral environments. So to do that, we collected and extensively validated data on contractual arrangements among politicians and firms in local governments in Benin, and find that when you have more electoral uncertainty, this overall increased state capture by firms. So firms become actually more aggressive in capturing the states when you have high level of electoral uncertainty. And this because it increases the direct form of capture. You know, you have not only lobbying politicians taking place for favorable policy, but you also have patronage and bureaucratic control by local firms. And we use a model to explain the logic of this result and look at policies that might limit capture. But first of all, by showing that, in fact, now we need to be more careful about the role that electoral uncertainty, which is the way you measure the quality of democracy, you know, because I mean, you feel like when politicians are threatened to be fired, they are going to behave and you'll have less corruption and less state capture. But in fact, if firms can switch from one form to another, in fact, things might actually be worse. So as a result, electoral competition alone might not lead to control of corruption and democratic consolidation. So the framework, the model that we set up is one in which basically it's the standard principal agent model, but with two twists. One is firms make transfer to a politician before an election, but get the rewards. That is the implementation of what the firm wants happens only after the election. That's one. The second is that politicians now firms can actually buy an insurance against electoral loss by politicians that they control, by in fact also buying off the bureaucracy. So they have the choice not only to implement or to demand and to get distortion being implemented, not only through making sure that a given politician wins the election, but they can also do it by controlling the bureaucracy. Okay, so and the results from the model roughly show that when you have more electoral uncertainty, the direct form attempt to capture the states increases. Okay, and but basically, direct form is an insurance that you buy against the electoral loss of the politician that working for you. So, and when there is more electoral uncertainty, the value of this insurance actually increases. So, and we also show that overall electoral uncertainty make state capture in general actually much worse. Okay, so the data collection was actually very involved. So we structured interview key players, campaign managers, CEO of connected firm, local brokers, ministries, like MPs and mayors, and covering the whole country. And we use snowball sampling techniques, chain referral. We know the top 6, and we ask them about who we should talk to go all the way down to local politicians. And we also have electoral data that we can use for control. And we use the response to the question we ask about the forward contractual arrangement to classify different forms of capture. And basically, when what is demanded and obtained is patronage, bureaucratic recruitment control, then that's direct capture, but anything else is indirect. So, and we have 3 specifications. So one, use commune level electoral competition measured by winning margin of the top candidates conditional on commune and political characteristics. So the second one exploits an electoral reform that took place in 1818 that collapsed the political systems into two blocks. So some places were highly competitive, fragmented, and became basically, two block or two party system. Some were less competitive, two blocks, and remain two blocks. So then you have a set of districts that were, that were treated and were competitive, became less competitive as a result. We also use, survey experiment, to understand how contract between firms and politicians will change with increased electoral competition. So I have a couple of results to show here. So first one is you can see here that at commune level, so the winning margin between the first and second candidate is negatively correlated with direct state capture. And when you look at legislative election, there is no correlation, So, and winning margin between second and third is irrelevant. So this shows that increased electoral certainty is associated with less direct control, and the effect is only present when electoral competition is relevant, which is correlated with the winning margin between the first and the second, not between the second and the third. And also, the effect is only present in elections where politicians have control over policy. So bureaucratic appointments are made at local level by the mayor, not by the MPs. So as a result, you can understand where it matters in local elections, municipal election, but not in legislative election. So, and then we did, a bunch of counterfactual analysis that show that improved bureaucratic selection and increased electoral competition do not really have any effect on the control and actually makes things worse, especially for electoral competition. So why? Well, because if the firms have portfolio of capture, then any policy which is increased electoral competition, which increase the competency of bureaucracy, can make them switch from one form to another, leaving things unchanged or sometimes worse. And I think what is fundamental, what I think is important for this paper is to show that electoral competition and electoral uncertainty is no panacea. So you can think that threat of firing politicians will be enough to actually reduce corruption, to reduce state capture, and improve welfare. In fact, here it makes things worse, if anything, because of the firms can switch from one form to another, So, so in the model, in the exercise, we show that one way to curb this is through political selection. For instance, if politicians are selected on the basis of how connected or disconnected they are from firms, and if there is a competition like grassroots mobilization, for instance, that help detect politicians that are connected to firms, so this will actually be a way to make electoral competition relevant, because the firms do not have the power, do not have the instruments necessarily to capture the states. And so it just shows that, for instance, something like primaries, where you have robust kind of debates in political parties, within political parties, about political connection and state capture, that will help select better kind of candidates. And that's one. Another thing, for instance, is controlling appointment process of politicians, of bureaucrats. Because for instance, as we see here, the reason why state capture works in local election, not in municipal elections, because mayors have power to appoint bureaucrats and legislators do not. So if by law, for instance, there is more transparency about this will clearly help the process. So overall, this paper made two, I think, important contributions. First is to look at how different forms of state capture can be affected by the political conditions, particularly electoral uncertainty, and how electoral uncertainty can actually be a curse, especially when you have firms being able to switch from lobbying to state capture, to bureaucratic capture. And and then what is also interesting is the empirical exercise, the survey we did to be able to sort of measure the contractual arrangement between firms and politicians through qualitative surveys and of different key stakeholders. Anyway, so thank you very much.
Great, perfect timing, Leonard. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? Please just raise your hands and you can ask it directly to Juan.
Thank you, Leonard. Very interesting. This topic is really important in developing countries, and so I was trying to get my head around about your taxonomy of state capture at the beginning and in the model, right? So, there is this indirect way of state capture and then the direct way of state capture, but then there's also, like, if you look at several countries, there's also some sort of coercive state capture, right? So I guess this coercive way of state capturing could be used. It might be used both for indirect and for direct state capture, but I don't know if it would be a different way of state capture, a different policy, a different tool that firms may have, or is just a particular instrument of direct state capture or not. That's one question. Yeah. The other thing is that you in your setting, you may have indirect state capture a priori, and then if it doesn't work because the candidate that you finance didn't win, you turn into direct state capture. But what you see in many settings is that the same firms, the same sort of elite finances different candidates for the same election, so that they ensure ex ante that they don't have to engage exposed in any direct state capture, because they're going to win whoever actually gets the higher number of votes in the election. So I don't know if that is something that could be included in the model in some way. And finally, just to be very brief, you were saying that your results imply that there's a scope for selection of politicians, but also another obvious policy implication of it is that campaign finance regulations should also be in place, and you didn't mention that. So those are my quick reactions to the paper. Thank you.
Fantastic. No, I think those are all great points. So campaign finance regulation is important for transparency, so that you can actually detect kind of connections. And I agree with you that in some environments, for instance, one form of insurance is to support both candidates, opposition and incumbent. But in the local elections, because of the small markets, it might be harder, to actually support two candidates at the same time, which makes it possible to separate, to make this strategy a little bit less viable. So I think it's, I agree with you entirely on that. Now, so what is interesting in our setting is that, in fact, the local bureaucrats are appointed by the central government. Basically, like many of the local bureaucrats working in local administration, they are civil servants appointed by the central government. So as a result, they are a counterpower, I should say, to the mayor, and they are free, independent to be captured, which makes the argument here, the modeling strategy here valid. Now, the point about coercive, I don't know what you mean. What you mean in particularly is situations where, like in Pakistan and some Latin American countries, where, for instance, the state capture sometimes involve capturing the military or the police, and not just the bureaucrats. Is that what you mean by coercive?
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying that coercive could also be sort of indirect or direct or ex ante or exposed, in the sense that you could, for instance, exclude other groups like opponents from participating in politics to begin with, because you kill them, for instance.
Yes, absolutely.
Or exposed, like in a direct sort of way, you could just threaten. It's like the plata or plomo paper by Dalbosa and Ditela. You could coerce them exposed into doing what you want.
Yeah, I agree.
So it's a form which could be both direct or indirect. Could be used both direct and indirect.
I agree. But I mean, the main point here is that we just have to go beyond elections and think about how we regulate the states to make it a little bit forcefully, to make it forcefully less connected to firms, especially to firms heavily involved in lobbying and capture. And the second point here is to also think of the important role of grassroots movements in, like Bernie Sanders in the US and others. The role that they play is to be able to affect the selection of candidates, and democracy cannot be effective unless we care more and more about selections of candidates. And one criteria is clearly, connections. And I'm very happy that it's a growing literature in political economy and development today, which is, political connection, state capture, and state capacity, and so on. We are trying to go beyond elections now as a way to control politicians and to, and improve democracy.
Okay, thank you for a fantastic set of presentations and a super interesting discussion, but we're already 3 minutes over, so I'm gonna have to close the session. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.